like to acknowledge all of the elders that are in the room tonight. I would like to acknowledge any elders who may be joining us who are from other cultures. I'd like to acknowledge other First Nations people, and I would like to acknowledge each and every person who has taken time out of their day to join us this evening for a very important conversation. I'd also like to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues, Jennifer Howard, the member for Ipswich, Charisse Mullen, the member for Jordan. I'd like to acknowledge Ipswich City Councillor Jacob Madsen, and I would like to acknowledge my fellow speakers and panel members, the Honourable Sallyanne Atkinson AO and Noel Pearson. It's an absolute pleasure and extremely daunting to be in such illustrious company. So, who am I? I'm Lance McCallum. I'm the state member for Bundamba. Proud Ipswich MP, along with Jen, with Charisse and Jim Madden. I'm also one of 3 current First Nations MPs that are serving in the Queensland Parliament. All 3 of us are members of the Palaszczuk government. Along with myself, there's Leanne Enoch, the member for Algesta, and Cynthia Louis, the member for Cook, who's the first Torres Strait Islander person to be elected to any parliament anywhere in Australia. The reason I bring that up is that some people may wonder, and I've been asked, Lance, if we've got people like you, First Nations people that are in Parliament, why do we need a voice? And I thought about it, and the first thing that came to my mind is that any MP that's elected to any Parliament, you take an oath, and your first duty, your honour, your privilege and your responsibility is to represent the constituents that elected you. I am elected to serve my community of Bundamba. Now, of course, every other MP might take on additional responsibilities. They might be formal in terms of being a minister or an assistant minister or some other function of the Parliament. But you also might take on some extra responsibilities due to who you are. You might be a leader in the gender space or some other area or demographic of society. When it comes to First Nations people in institutions like Parliament, the Queensland Parliament has been around for over 160 years. Over that time, there's been a little over 1,250 people that have had the privilege and the responsibility to be elected as MPs in Queensland. I am the 5th First Nations MP over that time. Keep in mind that 3 of us, 3 out of that 5, are sitting MPs right now, over 160 years. So that's not a lot. It's 0.034% there or thereabouts. The other thing is that, as is the nature of our democracy, politicians come and go. That's the reality of it. So when we talk about institutional and structural disadvantage, it's through institutions like Parliament that we've seen historic disadvantage. And institutions like Parliament, etc., have the evidence is very clear that they've not traditionally been a place for First Nations people. So that is part of the structural problems that have led to the disadvantage and the outcomes that we're seeing in modern day, that we see in the present day. That's why there's a gap in life expectancy. It's part of why there's a gap in healthcare, in education, in employment outcomes, and so on. So we know that over many, many years, many, many decades, many, many governments at all levels have tried with best intentions to address these issues of the result from structural disadvantage, close the gap, healthcare, education, employment, so on. Some of these efforts have resulted in some progress and some outcomes, but there is more to do. The best efforts to date haven't been enough. We need to do more, and we need to do something different. One of the things that hasn't been done is that there hasn't been a dialogue between governments, decision makers, etc., with First Nations people, not in the way that is proposed by The Voice. One of the reasons that I support The Voice is that I do believe it will result in practical outcomes when it comes to closing the gap on healthcare, education, employment. I do believe that we will see that, and I think that we will see real outcomes for the whole of our society. Economies will get boosted. Government expenditure will be either lower or able to be put to other uses. The other, probably one of the strongest reasons that I support The Voice is that it will help avoid what we've seen in the past when it comes to unjust policies that have been visited on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, who are probably the demographic that we have here in Australia where there has been the most laws, policies, programs aimed at us. And just to give an example of what I mean by avoiding unjust policies, when you think of horrible policies like the Stolen Generations, where children were forcibly removed from their families because of the colour of their skin, I would like to think that maybe we would avoid, or we could have avoided, policies like that if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had been asked, if there had been a dialogue. The Voice, for me, is about bringing us together. It is about unity, and it is about recognising the fact that we have been walking together for a very long time here in Australia, all of us. Whether our families have mingled, friends, long-standing relationships, we have this brilliant, brilliant country and society here with so much to celebrate. But we do need to face the reality of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the structural disadvantage that they have been subjected to. And finally, I just want to finish off by pointing out that in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have been on this land for over 60,000 years, we have the world's two oldest continuous living cultures. That's incredible. That is worth celebrating. That is what makes us, uniquely Australian. No other country in the world can celebrate that, can call it its own. So later this year, when the conversation is had nationally and we all get a chance to participate, because we all have agency in this referendum on the voice, we get a chance to celebrate being unified, being together, to celebrate what makes us uniquely Australian in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and to keep walking together forward on a path to reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Now, can you hear me up the back? You can. Oh, good. You know, I once worked with a minister called Jim Killen, who used to tell the story about going to an outback shed somewhere in South Australia and saying, "Can you hear me up the back?" And some bloke put his hand up and said, "Yes, I can, but I'd gladly change places with somebody who can't." So, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we speak a seat, and I do so on behalf of everybody in this room. Acknowledge the elders past, present and future. I would like to thank Jennifer for hosting tonight and organising it and inviting me, and I can tell you she makes a very good cup of coffee. I had to call her from the car. I arrived back in Brisbane this morning from Perth on what they used to call the red-eye special, and I was starting to fade a bit, so I said, "Oh," and she made me a lovely cup of coffee. But I was on a trip with my son around the Kimberley, and that reminded me of all the things that Lance has said about our ancient culture. 1.6 billion years, some of those lands, those drawings came. So it is a wonderful and very ancient culture, and yet another, if we needed another reason for supporting the work that we do. I was asked to speak a bit about why I'm here. Basically, I'm here as chairman of a body set up by the state government on the path to treaty. I am not an expert on the voice, like everybody else. I have opinions, but I've always believed in life that you stick to the job, focus on the task in front of you, and my task at the moment is to bring a treaty between the Queensland government, or the people of Queensland through the government, and Indigenous people, which will benefit everybody. I was asked a year or so ago by the then Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Craig Crawford, to be on this committee. And he asked me because he said, "You're non-Indigenous and you're Conservative." And I thought that was quite smart, not that he asked me, but that he asked somebody who came from the other side of politics. Because if we're going to talk about a treaty for all Queenslanders, particularly for my children and my children's children, we all have to support it. And I'm sure that's why you're here tonight, or at least to find out more. Now, what is the treaty? And many people get confused between the treaty and the voice. So the treaty is a state government initiative. Victoria, South Australia, West Australia, I think, are all doing it in one way or another, and the treaty process is different in every state. A treaty is basically, it's a simple concept. It's an arrangement or a negotiation between two organisations, two people, two nations, to agree on a shared future together. But part of having a future together is acknowledging the past. You can't really talk about the future until you recognise and acknowledge what went on in the past. So our task is now to work towards that, and we really began, I suppose, in a public sense in May this year, when State Parliament sat in Cairns and introduced a bill, and I can't remember what the bill was called, but anyhow, that doesn't matter. It's a bill to set up a treaty institute, and before we can have the treaty institute, which will be the structure within these negotiations can happen, you have to have truth-telling. So there will be a truth-telling inquiry, which will be a public process that everybody can be involved in. The committee, which I'm a co-chair of with Cheryl Buchanan, an Aboriginal woman from Western Queensland, consists of 10 people, 4 non-Indigenous and 6 Indigenous people. And I think that's a good balance. Michael Lavarch, who's one of the non-Indigenous, describes me as the token Tory, but that's all right. I've been many tokens in my life, as a lot of you will remember, and a lot of you will have experienced. The bill that went to Parliament, it was an historic bill because it was drawn up by a group of people from outside Parliament. It was drafted, of course, within Parliament, the parliamentary process, but it was really designed by us. And we went around this state, I don't know, Katie Kiss, who's here heading up our secretariat. How many communities, Katie? About 27 communities. We went up to TI, we went out to Western Queensland, we went all over the place asking people for their views. And so I congratulate the state government on the way they went about it. And I think, if I may say so, that is one of the reasons for the confusion with the voice, because it's all been a bit of a muddle as we've got there. But anyhow, I'm going to let Noel can carry on about that. And I'm very happy to take questions, but as I say, particularly on the treaty. And I think that's pretty well covered, isn't it? The treaty, that's right, I did mention to Jennifer beforehand, this is a very auspicious evening because tomorrow morning at 8:55, we will be handing over a report to Leanne Enoch, our Minister, which tells her what we think she should do, and we hope she does do it. But of course, that's the democratic process. We can just tell her about how the council for the Institute will consist of 10 Indigenous people. The inquiry will have 5 members, and there will be a balance between Torres Strait Island people and Aboriginal people. So I think we've pretty well covered everyone and everything. So again, thank you for having me here tonight. It's wonderful coming back to Ipswich. My brother-in-law was an obstetrician here for many years, Kevin Gilroy, and I'm looking around and wondering how many of your babies did he bring into the world? Or perhaps he even put you into the world, but depending on how you are. So, thank you. That's me. Oh, I should tell you how I got, that's right, looking at Noel. I started on this path, I guess, when my son-in-law, Seamus Parker, got to be mates with Noel because Seamus was on the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody all those years ago. And then my son Damien spent a year up at Ingenuity working with the people up there. So Noel and all my family have stayed in touch and been friends ever since. So as far as we're concerned, that's reconciliation. We don't need anything else, but we do need something else, and Noel will tell you about it.
When we started the Cape York Land Council, we happened upon a strategy of how do we get on to the 7:30 report? How do we get noticed by the media? And we devised a strategy of going to the local wedding hire suit shop and putting a suit on. All of a sudden they're saying, oh, the Cape York Land Council is so influential. That's how I met Sallyanne, because Prince Philip was out here to promote the protection of Cape York Peninsula, environmental protection. We were keen to get in front of him, and Sallyanne organised that. And next minute we were all over the press with Prince Philip giving us all his blessing for our Land Council agenda.
That's where I was, how I could do that.
Yes. So let me say that people around the country are saying, oh, this voice referendum is in trouble in Queensland. They say that we're the state that's the hardest. we're the state that is going to let the referendum down. I don't believe that. When Queenslanders properly understand the opportunity that we have with this referendum, I think we're going to say yes. We could well lead the country. Once we understand that we are the one state that has the two peoples, the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders. This is the home state of Eddie Mabo. How could the home state of Eddie Mabo vote the referendum no? We have a long history. We're the most decentralised state in the Commonwealth. And decentralisation means more Queenslanders know Aboriginal people than any other jurisdiction in the country towns, in the regional centres, in the rugby league football clubs. We have more relationships. We're only 3% of the population, but in Queensland we have more relationships because it's in the country towns and the regional centres and in places like Ipswich. Queensland is going to be so very important to this referendum, and we've got to get it right. This is a huge opportunity for all of us. We're going to complete Australia when we do this. The country and its constitution is incomplete. This is our chance to make it complete. It's a great country, but when we complete the country, it's going to be even greater. This is the most profound opportunity we will ever have to get this right. To bring together finally the full story of Australia. We have been prone to saying no when it comes to our relationship. We live in a no world. Australia today, as far as the Indigenous people are concerned, is in the default position of no. That was the answer in 1788. Surely the big question in 1788 was, what do we do about the blackfellas who are already here? And history gave the answer, no. And in 1901 we had another chance when we brought the country together. And remember, there were naysayers to the idea of Australia. You think we've got a no campaign now? The no campaign back in 1898 and 1899, they didn't want Australia to come together. They wanted to keep the colonies as colonies. But who of those people who voted no a few years later thought, Australia's not a bad idea? Who would have been grateful that the majority got up and said, no, we're going to do this, we're going to create Australia under a national constitution? So, we have this opportunity. It's a once-in-a-nation's-lifetime opportunity. You could say it's our last best hope, or you can say this is our first best chance. Okay. The concept of the voice and the alteration to the Constitution that we will be asked as Australians to consider later this year is simple but profound. And I want to tell all of you, the first and last place to look to in order to understand what this is all about is the actual provision itself. The provision that the Parliament has passed. This is what we're voting for. First duty as citizens, read it. Digest it. Think about it. Talk with your neighbours about it. Talk with your family about it. This is the first and last place to look. Have many other conversations about issues and what the case is for doing this and why it's important. But at the end of the day, please understand the actual words that are proposed. You don't have to be a constitutional lawyer to understand it. It's written in plain English. This is what it says, and my eyes are not good. There'll be a new section 129, and the title will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. And it reads, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. 1. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the final clause, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So there's 4 components. The first component is the recognition component. And it's a very short clause. The recognition component says, in recognition as the first peoples of Australia. That is very straightforward. That is easily understandable. It's historically correct. It doesn't go on and on and on for ages. It's about recognition as the first peoples of Australia. Do you think we can do this? The second part is guarantee. There's got to be a guarantee to the Indigenous people. And the Australian people are being asked to guarantee one thing in this constitutional alteration. To give a guarantee that the Parliament can't give, or the government can't give. This is a guarantee only the Australian people can give in a referendum. And that guarantee reads, there shall be a body. That's the guarantee. That's the historical compact. The Australian people will be saying in this referendum, yes, there shall be a body. It's not the Parliament saying it, it's not the government saying it, it is 19 million Australians voting in the referendum who are saying it. The third component is the purpose. What's the purpose of the voice or this body? Well, this section reads that it may make representations to Parliament and government. And Professor Toomey from Sydney University Law School, constitutional lawyer, kind of taught me, once again, something I didn't know. But make representations, she pointed out very plainly, is what everybody does in a democracy. When you try to put something to the Parliament or the government, you make representations. And it doesn't mean Palaszczuk immediately says, oh, they've made representations to me. I'm going to now have to follow it. You make representations in the hope that your arguments are good, and the government may follow you, and the Parliament may follow you, or do something about the problem, but representations are what everybody does. And the reason why there's a particular provision for Indigenous people to make representations is because the Parliament has a particular law-making power in relation to them. Section 51(26) of the Constitution gives the Federal Parliament power over Indigenous people that it doesn't exercise in relation to everybody else. And when it does that, perhaps it should consult with the people affected by it. And finally is the question of detail in the last clause. Yeah, detail. Have you heard about detail? Where's the detail? Who's hiding the detail? This is the answer to the detail. The Parliament shall have power to make laws, including composition, functions, powers and procedures. All the questions we have about, oh well, who will be represented and what functions will they have and what procedures will they follow? All of those questions have got to be answered by the Parliament. That's how our system works. I can say what the voice should look like, what the model should be, but that's just my personal opinion. I'm not a parliamentarian. And by the way, this provision says it's the Parliament, not the government. Because the government, the Albanese government, has to actually get it through the Senate. The detail has to go through the Senate, with the Greens, with the Independents, with the Liberal and National Party senators. This whole argument about detail has been a huge diversion. A diversion led by the very people responsible for furnishing the detail in the event that the referendum is passed. Before I finish, I just want to point out the Australian Broadcasting Commission, ABC. There's legislation creating the ABC and chapter and verse about how it's supposed to be constituted, how it operates, the governance of it and everything else. But it was first generated by Parliament, the detail was generated by Parliament in 1932 under a constitutional power called Postal, Telegraphic, Telephonic and Other Like Services. So the ABC fits under Other Like Services. In 1901 they had no idea about the future ABC. So in 1932 the Parliament creates the Australian Broadcasting Commission. 10 years later, in 1942, they substantially amend it, And then in 1983 they overhaul it completely to create the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The point is, the Constitution stays the same, the detail changes according to Parliament. And the Parliament might have a reason to change the ABC legislation in 10 years' time, or 5 years' time, or 25 years' time. It's the same thing with the voice. The referendum will give the Parliament constitutional power, and then it's the responsibility of the Parliament to legislate the detail. And it would be misleading to the Australian people if you said, oh, this is the model. Well, whatever is legislated as the first model is not the permanent model, because we know that the Parliament always has the power to change the model. So this whole thing about detail is overlooking the plain words of the provision. And I urge Queenslanders to read the provision and ask themselves the question that, do we want to move to an Australian constitution that has these words, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia? Are we ready for this? Are we ready to flick the switch to yes? And I think once we understand that as Queenslanders, and the fact that we are a special state, no other state has the two peoples as part of its constituency. For Queenslanders to do the right thing here would be to honour your fellow Queenslanders in the Torres Strait and in the mainland. So I want to thank Jennifer and Lance and colleagues for this great opportunity to talk to you about a conversation we need to have with our fellow Queenslanders. It is a crucially important state, and the opportunity for Australians is absolutely vital.
Thank you so much. Oh, is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much. I've just realised I am sitting next to three of the most extraordinary storytellers, and what I'm about to ask next is a bit risky, but we're going to try and keep it brief so that we can get questions from the floor. But I do want to direct a question to you, Lance. Given a model of Aboriginal strength and leadership, which is essentially what The Voice is, what do you think is the potential scope? I mean, how could it improve, on a practical sense, the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Queensland?
So I think that the starting point to answer that is in the constitutional amendment that Noel has so eloquently spoken about tonight, which is to provide advice on matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Matters such as healthcare, such as education, such as the kinds of justice reforms that are required to address over-representation. The kind of advice that will lead to increased life expectancy, to bring life expectancy back up in line with everyone else. So they're the kinds of things that I think that The Voice can do and can help with. I also think that the voice will be able to provide a really good mechanism for celebrating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. I spoke a little bit about it being what makes us uniquely us. And people come from all over the world to experience Australia and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, the two oldest continuous living cultures in the world. And I think that a body like The Voice will mean that we can all celebrate it and experience it in a fuller, richer way, and it will enrich Australia.
Thank you. Sallyanne, as a strong advocate for reconciliation in Queensland, around the path to treaty, how do you see a voice as being consistent with creating meaningful, real change in our state of Queensland?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I've focused entirely on the treaty because I've always believed that you have to stick to the task at hand, and that's what I've been doing. And I have to say, which I've said before, that at the beginning of this year, when this discussion started, I was pretty agnostic about the voice. I didn't really understand what it meant. I could understand what the treaty meant, but the voice does seem to me to be a bit muddled. But as the year has gone on, and I've listened to people, and I've read things, and I decided some months ago anyhow that I was going to vote yes, for the very reason, well, no, this was the first reason, that the alternative was too awful to contemplate. That if we as a nation vote no for this historic moment, you know, how is that going to look? How is that going to be for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? How is it going to be for the rest of the world? But so I thought, righto, I'm going to vote yes. And I was absolutely delighted that when the treaty bill went to Parliament in May, the entire LNP voted for it. So I have made no comment on the federal thing because that's not my area of sphere of influence. But I was really pleased, and you know, I thought that was great, that to show that we were all for it. But then when you hear people, no, there's no, I say people like Noel, there's nobody else like Noel. When I hear Noel speak with such emotion and feeling, but common sense and logic, which I'm afraid has been missing from this debate on both sides quite a lot. And it's sad that we have to be campaigning yes or no, that it's become like a political campaign, because we should be able to talk about it and discuss it without having to go through all that, but we do. But do you know, the thing that struck me the other night, I was watching Q&A and Rachel Perkins, and they were talking about the AUKUS deal, and Rachel said, that's a good example of what the voice will not do, because it's not directly affecting Indigenous people. And I thought, that's another good reason for it. And Noel, I'd forgotten Noel's story about it was City Hall when I was Lord Mayor, and the Duke of Edinburgh was coming, and Noel and Gordon Pablo and Frankie Demal from Cape York were trying to work out how they could get this message. They wanted to meet Prince Philip, because he was here for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, I think was his thing. And I did say to Gordon Tabler, who happened to have some feathers or something, if you get dressed up like that, I can get you to meet Prince Philip, and you'll be on the front page of the Australian. And they were. I have some uses. There you are, Noel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I'm really sorry to have to do this, but you know, just to maybe address some of those common misunderstandings, some myth-truths and myths, and I want to thank you because you did, in your introduction, address a whole heap of them. But there's still a lot of talk about things like High Court challenges, about inferring special rights onto a group of people in Australia. I was hoping that, Noel, you would be able to talk around maybe those two misunderstandings.
Okay. The Firstly, the actual provision. We had two former Chief Justices of the High Court review the provision and provide recommendations for amending it. This has been a very rigorous process. We've the objective all along was to uphold the Constitution and recognise Indigenous people. That was our objective. How do we uphold the Constitution and recognise Indigenous people at the same time? And I think this provision has done that. It upholds the Constitution. And that means that the provision doesn't derogate from the supremacy of the Parliament. Our Australian system is based on the supremacy of Parliament, and this provision does not do that. It doesn't derogate. It upholds parliamentary supremacy. There was a whole lot of debate, particularly early in the year, about, there'd be High Court challenges, particularly if executive government advice was ignored. Advice to the executive government was ignored. The truth is that advising Parliament on laws is a once-in-a-blue-moon exercise. Parliament doesn't make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people every year. I think the last time they did it was 10 years ago. So the parliamentary side of the amendment is actually a very it's infrequent. The crucial bit is the operation of the executive government. That's a week to week, month to month, year to year, affecting the lives of families and communities and programs and policies. That's the real action. And so here we will have a voice that interacts with the government of the day and with the bureaucrats and the departments so that the practical issues affecting Indigenous communities are addressed. It's important to have the executive government involved because the function in Canberra of advising the Parliament is a kind of a matter of high policy and only occurs infrequently. Now, I'll give you one example of advising the executive government. You will all have heard of the Juukan Gorge tragedy. 46,000 years of occupation blown up by a mining company. Now, I've read every shred of paper on that disaster, and the fact is that Juukan Gorge could have been saved. It could have been saved by an emergency declaration under the Heritage Protection Act of the Commonwealth. We already have the law. We've had the law since 1984 to protect places like that. It's just that in order to invoke an emergency declaration, you've got to somehow get through to the relevant minister, bring it to her attention or his, and put all the evidence in front of her, enable her to understand what the issue is, and in order for her to make a decision. That never happened. The traditional owners were ringing around. You can read the parliamentary reports about this. They're ringing around, who's the minister responsible? And can we get hold of her? Oh, we'll call you back. This literally goes on until the point the place is blown up. Now, in my view, I think the minister was dodging and weaving. didn't exercise her ministerial responsibility to protect this site. There was a lot known about it. It had been the subject of studies for many, many years. But when the time came, the law wasn't used. Now, in cases like that, all we have to do is the traditional owners, when you talk about procedures, one of the procedures I think should be that in cases like that, there be an ability on the part of traditional owners to go to the Voice to say to the minister, provide advice to the minister, please, please, this place is going to be blown up soon. You should step in and have a look at this and issue an emergency declaration. That's the executive government. The executive government affects everything in the communities of Indigenous peoples. And it's crucial that the Voice enable that communication and that making of representations to the government. So, you know, I think, as I said, we had two former Chief Justices look over this amendment, propose refinements to it, and we have a very safe proposal. It is one that upholds the Constitution, and I think it's now time to put, you know, the fear campaign has been, what is it? AUKUS submarines, parking tickets. I think Peter Credlin said once on Sky that, oh, what if the gunman in the Lint Cafe was Indigenous? Would the police have to contact the Voice first? So anyway, we've got a good provision. It's been hammered out over a long period of time. It's now time for the Australian people to read it, understand it. The plain English meaning is very evident, and let's vote on it.
All right, thank you so much. Now, we're going to take some questions from the floor. We have got a roving mic that's running around, so because we've still got people online, I hope you're still there. Just so that they can hear what your question is as well. If you'd like to pop your hand up, stand up, so let yourself be seen if you want a question. Start off with your name and just really clearly the question so we can hear. Oh, don't all speak at once. Off the front. Oh, mic's coming.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's beautiful. I have a question to the whole panel. It's really I know this is a domestic issue, but it's really a global question about the United Nations, and I know that they, over the years, have expressed great concern about how Australians have treated Indigenous people here in Australia. And I'm just wondering if the Voice has been endorsed or supported by the United Nations, or a United Nations treaty of some sort. I know it's a domestic issue, but I just thought I'd start with a macro question.
Well, thanks very much for your question, Sarah. I am aware of United Nations Charter for Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of United Nations charters. I haven't seen any publication, any advice from the UN, or frankly from anywhere else that has put the referendum question of the voice up against or within the context of a UN charter. I think that is probably likely to happen down the track when/if the referendum is successful and a body is established in terms of the voice. But at the moment, we are heading towards the vote on the referendum. The actual words for the constitutional amendment have been settled, and the national conversation of with 19 million Australians to ask whether or not we should amend the Constitution is the task that is right before us right now, and that is the very important question.
Well, Noel and I have just whispered to each other that we really are not experts in this area, but the United Nations does have a Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and I would imagine that that would cover that without actually them having to go out and specifically campaign or comment on it, because they would just take it for granted that this is covered by the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. There you go.
Philip from Brassel. Now I'm old, so just bear with me. But in the early 90s, and you mentioned Eddie Mabo, we had the Mabo decision, right? At that time, you know, I'll call them the conservative press, wrote that we were going to lose our houses, we were going to lose our land. You know, the Courier Mail was very much on this area. I'm yet to meet one person that has lost their house, has lost their land, and that's 30 odd years ago. Are we going to see the same rot from the No campaign?
I mean, that's the sort of fear-mongering that people use. I mean, I remember at the time of Mabo, because I'm old as well, that particularly the graziers, particularly people who were really well connected to their land in a way perhaps that city people aren't, well, they had the fear of God put into them, that they were going to lose their properties, they were going to lose their cattle, they were going to lose. Well, it didn't happen. And everybody knows it didn't happen. So that's the strongest argument, I think, that we should put up to say, no, 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 people said that then and it didn't happen. And they also didn't quite understand the concept of Aboriginals' attitude to land. They didn't want to sort of fence the land in and take it away, and, you know, it was just being considered their land and being able to be there. So I think we have to really use that as an example of what fear-mongering can do, and it did put fear into people. I remember being, you know, people talking to me and saying, gosh, you know, this is going to be terrible. Lady up there. Tyler, oh, you've got someone there.
My name's Joshua Konofsky. I'm a teacher, and I would think that a lot of people in my profession would be a bit more educated about this, but I myself aren't. So my question is mostly to Noel, but just in general. You said that there has been a lot of review, and it has gone on for a very long time, and it's gone through all these processes, but there's been a lot of people that I've talked to that are under this impression that it's been rushed through. And I think if I could get have more detail, I'm sure I could look this up and educate myself, but I think it's a question that a lot of people have, is like, how much and how long has it been going through this process? If you've got the answer.
Okay, the process that's now come to the last part of the race this year began in 2011. The Gillard government established an expert panel in consultation with the opposition, and that was the first process with the expert panel. And then there was a parliamentary inquiry. I think it was led by Ken Wyatt for the Liberals and somebody from Labor. And then we had the referendum council that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And again, process of consultation around the country. And then there was another parliamentary inquiry, co-chaired by Liberal Julian Leeser and Senator Pat Dodson. And then we had the Kalma-Langton process of working out the detail of how a voice might look. So there's a kind of 300 or 400 page report that took 3 years to do, and that's available. No other public policy issue has been the subject of as much reports as this one, or has taken as much time as this one. Whenever have we had an issue go on for 15 years? And if you look at the policy platforms of the parties, remember 4 out of the 5 governments were Liberal national parties. They were coalition governments. And yet they had in their platforms commitment to constitutional recognition. So there has not been a government that has gone to an election in these 15 years that hasn't been committed to constitutional recognition. And yet, the problem with the Conservatives is I would have preferred them to have taken this to a referendum, so that we could have bipartisanship. And I worked very hard to with my colleagues, trying to achieve that result, to get the Conservatives to lead on this. But it was like, oh, kick the ball down the road a bit, because we've got our own internal tussles, right? Why we don't have bipartisanship today has got nothing to do with the voice. It's got to do with leadership struggles and factional struggles inside those parties. I think that we missed a great opportunity when there was no leadership that was willing to be courageous and say, no, this is not about us. This is about the Australian people and about Australia. So we've now got our chance. It hasn't been rushed. It's taken a very long time. We'll have the printer running for a few hours to print everything that's been written about this. And now we're approaching the time. And I keep coming back to, well, if you really want the detail, read the provision. Because that's how the Constitution works. The Constitution is about the provision. It's not about the legislative detail.
I've got over here. Hi, Augustine. I just want to ask further to a question I asked Noel earlier in the evening. I understand that the voice is going to be enshrined in the Constitution, and we've talked about we'll have the voice as representation in representatives, you know, within the community, the rural community, we get their voice. What's to say that when we have a change of government, or that the voice that is the voice, the representation from the rural, you know, I'm just saying rural areas, Queensland, Brisbane, the same body as what's getting enshrined in the Constitution? What I'm just trying to get at is, if we've enshrined that body, are all the representation that we are going to get over time the same as that body? I'm just worried that if we have a change of government, they don't agree with it, they scrap that, and then all of a sudden we've got this token body.
Okay. All of the details about the body are always determined by Parliament. So Parliament could change it. Of course, when they do, we'll be having a say about it. And so Parliament's always got the ability to change the legislation. What doesn't change is the constitutional guarantee. And the constitutional guarantee has only I can't count, has got 5 words that will always be the same. There shall be a body. That's the thing that doesn't change, because that's the guarantee. The Australian people will have provided a guarantee to our people that no matter what changes are made, there shall be a body. And I think that's important, that there be a guarantee. You can change all the details, but the commitment that's being made in this alteration is to say there will always be a body. That's where Indigenous people are entitled to make representations to the Parliament.
Can't hear.
Hello? No? I've got to talk very loud. Okay. So my question's about the Productivity Commission report, which came out and said that despite best efforts, the executive government of Australia is still not working well with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to close the gap. And so the coalitions of peaks has been trying their best, but I suppose my question is, would the Voice or that body be a vehicle for us to perhaps push to get better collaboration with the federal government on closing the gap?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's going to be crucial to that. But we've got to get the design right. It's got to be a mixture of local and regional. That's where the action is. And national. The action's got to happen at the level of Cherbourg, or Arrakun, or Ipswich. That's where the action has to happen. But the big policy questions are going to be resolved down in Canberra to enable the action to take place on the ground here. So I absolutely think it's crucial to the closing the gap agenda.
Young bloke like me. My name's Jim Ralph, and Yuin Country in Gambangi, New South Wales. Got to yell, do I? Get back to my football days. Yeah, look, I haven't got a question. I just want to thank the panel for what they're doing. It's great. And for those people who are in doubt on the yes vote and they're asking a question they're not too sure about it, my personal thing is you get back and learn a little bit about the history of what's happening. And that's what it's all about. We've all been through things. I'm nearly 80 years of age and I've been waiting for something this like to happen. And I'm glad to see that we're moving. And I want to see more of the younger generations, like the young lady who just asked a question, of being involved where we're moving ahead. It's so important. And I'd like to thank the panel for what they've been doing.
I cannot believe we're on time. Firstly, I want to take the opportunity to thank our wonderful three panellists, and I'm sure you'll join me again on thanking them again. A huge thank you needs to go to Jen as well for facilitating the opportunity for this tonight. I've said it before at the very start, it means so much that we get to do this in my hometown, on my home turf, and I'm so proud when I look around and I see my neighbours and my few colleagues here as well, and people that I pass in the street in my hometown here and support. So I want to thank you guys as well. But before we do finish up, on a really serious note, I want to sincerely acknowledge Mob in the room today. You are carrying such a huge load in this campaign, and we feel it every day. And it's getting tougher and it's going to get hard. And I appreciate you guys fronting up today, appreciate what you do in your workplaces with your families. But in solidarity, every person in the room today, I want you to take down this number. It's 13 yarn. 13 yarn is a number that you can call, you can give it to people, First Nations people who are suffering and the trauma that comes up, and when we have these conversations and we're hearing it every day, we don't get to go home and turn the TV on anymore and not hear about this. This is a trauma-informed practice where you can ring up and speak to a trauma-informed counsellor. So the number is 13 yarn. In solidarity, I'd like everyone to write that down. So, thank you.